Okay, so as I just said, page 1020, it's chapter 5, and we're going to pick up with verse 16. And this is our third and I expect final session on the Ten Commandments. We've covered the first five, and as I took note when we began this in-depth study of the Ten Commandments, they can be divided neatly into 5 and 5. The first 5 talk about our relationship with God and our obligations to God and the things that we are not permitted to do, such as use God's name in vain, for example, and also the positive aspect of our relationship with God, in that we share with God this idea of Shabbat. And last time we talked at some length about Shabbat. Shabbat, like the other commandments here, is not given to us in detail. It is really the rabbinic tradition that fleshes out what it means to say you should honor or remember the Sabbath day. And we're going to see that also clearly as we move on to the next commandment. And that is the commandment to honor our parents. Beginning in verse 16, Kabed et avicha ve'et imecha, you should honor your father and your mother as God has commanded you. And then we get the consequences of honoring and failing to honor, that you may long endure and fare well in the land that the Lord your God is assigning you. Now, this is very striking because none of the other of the 10 commandments discusses reward and punishment. In fact, as we move on, we're going to see commandments that are extremely brief. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. No sense of why you shouldn't do these things, or what the consequences will be to you if you do. Nor have we seen that in the previous 5. So it's quite striking. And to look at what are the consequences that you, meaning not as individuals, but as the Jewish people as a whole, will endure and fare well on the land. Remember that Moses is speaking to them now as they're about to enter the land. And we have here the sense that it's contingent. The land is not given to us unconditionally. There are things we could do, things we could violate, which would end in us being sent out of the land. And indeed, that happens in Jewish history. There come points at which Jews are exiled from the land, notably in 586 under the Babylonians. When we are sent into Babylonian exile, the land ceases to become the land of the people of Israel for a time. We're never excluded completely, but if we don't behave in a certain way, just like the Canaanites before us, we too can be expelled from the land. Now, we'll come back to this, but I want to go to the beginning of this commandment and to take note of the fact that what we see here, we use the word kabed, right? Covet. Give covet, kabed, and the translation here, accurately enough, is honor. This is not the first commandment that we have about our parents. I can turn back. You don't need to do that. It's just a sentence. But if you go back to Leviticus 19:3, Ish ve'imo va'aviv, Ish imo va'aviv tirau. You should revere and literally fear your mother and your father and keep my Sabbaths. So we have this idea that we have to honor them, revere them, respect them. It's interesting that in Leviticus, where it talks about awe or fear, the mother comes first, your mother and your father. And here where it talks about honoring, your father comes first. The notion is not that your father is owed more than your mother, even though the father comes first. The rabbis look at this difference and they say, well, in the case of fear or awe, the mother comes first because you might be likely to give more awe to your father, who traditionally is your teacher. There's a sense of almost fear. And so we're told, no, your mother too. Mother comes first. And here, where it's talking about honor, you might have more warm feelings towards your mother naturally. And so your father comes first. What I wanted to share with you now is a rabbinic analysis of this, which, if you think about it, what we're given very abstract words, like honor the Sabbath, right? Here, honor your father and your mother. Well, what does that really mean? What are we supposed to do in order to show that honor? And similarly, looking back to Leviticus, what does it mean to have awe or fear of a parent? How is that actually enacted in public? So I'm going to share my screen. And this is from the Talmud in a tractate called Kiddushin, page 31b. And we get here a statement to New Rabbanan. Rabbis taught, what is fear? Ezehu morah ve'ezehu kibud. What is fear and what is honor? And now we're given specific information. Fear, right? Which is morah or yirah. What does that mean? You should not stand in your father's fixed place. You may not sit in his place. You may not contradict his statements by expressing an opinion contrary to that of your father. And you may not choose sides when your father argues with someone else. So all of that has to do with this sense of awe. And it's not something, I want to qualify it in a series of ways. First of all, this reflects rabbinic culture, right? And it reflects rabbinic culture from probably the first century of the Common Era and the world that they lived in, right? And some of it existed right up until modern times. So the idea of not sitting in your father's place, right? I think, at least when I grew up, and perhaps when some of you grew up, you didn't, at the table, your father, your mother had their places, and it was a little bit chutzpah to sit down, especially if your father's there, and perhaps even when he's not there, to sit in his place. We generally don't have families today, they're not so, it's not such a value. But so I want to look overall at what these behaviors mean. Contradicting your father's statements here clearly means in public. It's not that you cannot say, I think you're wrong about that, but you can't say it when your father or your mother is speaking in public to a large group. I remember years ago, I was in a congregation in Massachusetts. We brought in really a noted scholar as a scholar in residence, and his father happened to be a member of the congregation. And his father asked him a very pointed question, which sort of showed that the father thought he was off base, right? It didn't really sit well with people, but imagine the reverse, right? where the father is the scholar in residence. The father is the one to whom sort of, this sense of awe is appropriate, right? And the son is letting him know in public that he's just wrong. Okay, so I think that's the sense of it. Or choosing sides. This is the first one is, Dad, you're wrong. And the second is that when Dad is arguing with someone, you say, the guy who's arguing with Dad is wrong. So all of this has to do, if you want to look at it more generally, with standing, right? With deference, that you should give deference to your parents. There's an acknowledgement of your position relative to their position. You should be deferential, assume that, at least in public, that they know more than you do, right? Though you may be frustrated with what they do. And even there's another classic rabbinic text, which, what do you do when your father says something that's clearly wrong when it comes to the Torah? Right? Your father's teaching something, you know it to be wrong. You can't just say you're wrong, but what you would say is, oh, can you explain to me how this passage is different from this other passage, which, at least on the surface of it, seems to contradict what you're saying? How do you explain that? Right. So you're asking your parent to actually act in a role as a teacher, even though, in a sense, what you're saying is, I don't know, it's based on this verse, you seem to be wrong. So it's not so much what you say as how you say it. It's about maintaining that. So I would say, if you wanted to look to a modern analog of this, though it's not in this rabbinic text, I think simply because it was unthinkable for the rabbis, it would seem to be a violation of this to call your parents by their first names, as opposed to, and the classic way of referring to your father is my father, my teacher. I mean, there really is a great deal of respect in that, as opposed to, say, Gary. Right? Now, families are different, right? And there are families where it's acceptable to call their parents. But I think from the point of view of Jewish tradition, and from the point of view of how the Jewish tradition has understood this sense of awe, of yira, fear, putting yourself on a first name basis with your parent, and in a sense denying that, giving the sense that we're all the same, you're like me, we're just, I would treat my father like he's one of the guys, and that does not seem to be what this passage, at least as the rabbis understand it, is here to teach us, right? I'll give you one other example before we move on to the second part of the statement. It's an interesting moment, generally speaking, in a family. It is the parent who leads the Seder on Passover. Now, there may come a moment in which that shifts to the next generation. But there's something about that moment which I think this text is speaking to. That this deference, this sense, the father, the teacher, and when it happens, when that shifts happens, there's a certain, and I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, right? There's a certain diminishment of the awe, respect of the father. I sense that, no longer as relevant as he used to be, right? Now, not necessarily, let's say that the son, goes off and becomes a rabbi. knows more than the father might say to the son or the daughter who became a rabbi, I'd love it if you lead the Seder. And certainly we turn over to our children at least one small part of the Seder, and we're so proud when they learn to say Manishtana, right? But nonetheless, it's at least with taking over the leading of the Seder, there's something a little fraught about that, something that feels, I don't know, uncomfortable, perhaps, about that. Okay, so the idea of awe, fear, really refers to one's placing oneself, one shouldn't place oneself as an equal and not give deference. What is honor? And here we get, and that's the word that's actually used in our version of the Ten Commandments. He gives his father food and drink, dresses and covers him, brings him in and takes him out for all his household. Okay? In other words, you care for your parent. I want to mention one other thing. It's probably obvious here, but I think it's worth mentioning. The commandments here are addressed to adults, right? You don't see here anything about obey, right? It doesn't mean you have to do, sometimes you see parents who'll say to their kid, the kid does, you tell them to do something, they don't do it. And it says, the Torah says, honor your father and your mother, you're supposed to do what I told you to do, right? This is not that. This is about the relationship between grown children and their parents. And that's why I think this particular passage is interesting, because it's really about taking care of your parents, taking care of their physical needs, while showing them respect and deference, bringing them in, taking them out, caring for them. And there is a sense, I think, though it's not explicit, implicitly, that this is a kind of payback. Your parents do this for you when you're a child. And there may come a time at which they're no longer there to do it for themselves, and therefore the obligation falls on the children to do it for their parents. Now, the Gemara, the Talmud, immediately raises an interesting question, right? And that is, from whose funds must one give his father and his mother food and drink, right? Where do you have to expend let's assume that your parents have money. You have to use your funds to do this. And we have a disagreement here. Rav Yehuda says from the money of the son. Rabbi Natan Bar Oshaya says from the money of the father. And the sages give a ruling on this, and they gave it either to Rav Yirmiyah or the son of Rav Yirmiyah. The halacha, the law actually is, it's paid from the money of the father. So now, the assumption here is the father has money. If the father becomes indigent, then it is the obligation of the child to pay. Doesn't mean they have to. It's the obligation of the child to pay. So this reminds me of my father and his mother. My grandmother, not that she didn't have money, but she was frugal, to put it kindly. And both of them, you had my father and his mother had lived through the Depression. My grandmother needed new shoes. Shoes she had were worn out. My father took her to the shoe store. The prices were, from her perspective, too high, right? Even though they were, the prices of the day. we're not talking about, a pair of $1,000 shoes. We're talking about what things cost, but she wasn't used to that. And so my father went over to the salesman and he said, tell her that they cost X. And he made up the difference when she bought them between what she was willing to pay and what he was able to pay. Now, this wasn't about her money versus his money. This was about a kind of honoring which took into account who she was. And, it wasn't that he said to her, I'll buy these, they're expensive, don't worry, I'll buy them for you.
He let him do
It would
it.
actually be less honorable in a way, because it's not treating her with a certain respect. So I thought it was, I remember it to this day as a certain kind of behavior. So I want to go back now. I'm going to stop the share. I want to finish the commandment now. We're back in our book, and I just want to say another word about the idea that two more words about the idea that if you follow this commandment, you'll do well, you'll live on the land for a long time, and if not, you'll lose it. This commandment and this consequence is seen two places, not the commandment, but the consequence is seen two places in the Torah. This one, and then surprisingly enough, though it has a certain resonance here, we have a law that says when you take birds or eggs from a nest, you send away the mother bird first, right? The implication is that it causes the mother bird a certain pain, right? And you shoo it away. Not that coming back to the nest and the empty nest would not presumably cause pain. Now, how much pain does it cause? The rabbis are reading in, the Torah itself is kind of reading into the situation. The point, and it does deal with parents and children in a way, right? So there's some parallelism, but the rabbis have a wonderful comment about this. And it's a comment on a statement in Pirkei Avot, right? That book in the Mishnah of Ethics. And it says, there's a statement there that you should be as careful and punctilious about a minor mitzvah as a literally an easy mitzvah versus a hard mitzvah. And then in the commentary, they bring this fact that this is a major mitzvah and a hard one. It's the relationships between adults and their adult parents can be very difficult. This can be hard, right? Especially, your parent is wrong, and how do you respond to that? And, how do you care for them? And what are the limits of your obligation to care for them? And what if you feel they're not getting enough care and, you want them to bring someone in to help them out in the house, but they don't want that? It's very complicated, very complicated. But shooing away the mother bird, takes a second, and you take the eggs, and that's it. It's an easy mitzvah. So the rabbis say, don't discriminate between an easy mitzvah and a hard one, a weighty mitzvah and a minor one, because you don't know the reward. And here, where we're told rewards, look, it's the same, the easy one and the hard one. Last thing I want to say about this idea of consequence. And I came across this in a commentary. If you look, actually, it's also here. If you look at the bottom of page 1120, and I'm talking about above the line, some ancient legal documents make children's right to inherit their parents' property contingent on their honoring their parents by providing and caring for them. Here, God applies the same condition on a national scale. The right of future generations of Israelites to inherit the land of Israel from their parents is contingent on their honoring. This is a really fascinating comment. Okay, so we've made it through. We've made it through the sixth. One more thing. Last thing. This is the first of the commandments about how we treat people, and in some ways, it also looks back to the commandments about how we are to treat and respect and honor God, because there is this notion that we learn how to honor God from honoring our parents. That becomes a kind of model for how we treat God as well. Okay, so I'm going to open this up for questions before we move on to what is really a series of very short statements. So we'll go to the gallery view, and I welcome your questions or comments at this point. Yeah, Anna, you're first out of the.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention my daughter Tali will not let anyone sit in Nahum's chair.
There you go. And
there are a lot of...
even though he's deceased, right? So that and we thank you for mentioning that also, because we have a tradition. What does it mean to honor your parents? We see this elsewhere, both while they're alive and after they're deceased, right? And that's one of the reasons why the obligation to say Kaddish for all you're obligated to say Kaddish for members of your nuclear family, right? Parents, spouse, brother, sister, child, unfortunately, right? And you say it for other relatives for 30 days, shloshim. But your parents, you say it for 11 months, just short of a year. Why the difference? Right? And you can say, well, the loss, what would be worse than the loss of a child? The loss is so much greater, that your parents, having lived long, productive lives. But no, we have an obligation to honor our parents, and that honoring continues not only during their lifetime, but afterwards. And I think Tali it's a beautiful, really. Chana, were you going to say something else?
Yeah, one other thing that was curious to me when we spoke about kavod, the word in Hebrew for liver is kaved. It's the same.
Right.
Source.
Right.
What is?
So I can't tell you.
Why
Yeah, kaved is heavy. That's what its fundamental meaning is, and I'm trying to remember if it's spelled the same way, because I just don't remember how you spell kaved. I don't know. I don't think there's an intrinsic connection. That's all I can say. There are cognates, even in Hebrew. There are, just as we have in English, words that have different meanings but are spelled the same. I don't know. Good. Anybody else have? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I couldn't help but think of Archie Bunker of All in the Family, who insisted that his chair be used only by him.
Yes. So, despite
I don't know that the character was aware of the interpretation of the commandment.
I doubt it. But despite his racism, right, and terrible qualities, he did insist on being honored in that way. Great. Any other?
I also have a question. Does this commandment? How does this commandment extend to women, mother, also to uncles or grandfathers?
No, this is really so. Grandparents, yes, but other relatives, no. Right, but there is the rabbis do extend this to grandparents as well. So you honor those who they have to show honor to. So in that way, it's unlike Kaddish. Right? I talked about the length of time, but here it's really directly parents, and that's the language of the text. The text doesn't generally talk about grandparents I can't think of a single commandment in the Torah that has anything. If it does, it talks about the aged, right? But not particularly your grandparents. Mipnei seva takum, rise before the aged, right? So showing respect to the aged, but it's only standard. It's only rising when they come into the room, something which rabbinic tradition also talks about with respect to your teacher. Right? It's a way of showing respect. Here it's the father, but there are others, and we still have that rudimentary, in a rudimentary way. Certainly, if you go to yeshiva, they have it. You know, the teacher walks into the room, all the students stand up. But we have it in the court system, interestingly enough, right? The judge comes in, please rise before the judge, and the judge says you may be seated. So one of my friends said that's the most essential thing that you learn in rabbinical, that they don't teach you in rabbinical school, which is to tell people, please rise and you may be seated. Anyway, during the service. Okay, anything else before we move on to the next commandment? Okay, so let me switch the view, go to the speaker, and we move on now to coming back here to you should not murder, right? And it is not thou shalt not kill. I just want to emphasize that. Where does that idea come from? It's the language of the King James translation, right? Which says thou shalt not kill. Here, you shall not murder. So it's not killing. But we know that there are, excuse me, places where the Torah permits it. Warfare is permitted, particularly defensive warfare. Right? You are, according to the Torah, permitted to kill someone who's coming to kill you, where you have a reasonable fear that that person is called a rodef, pursuer, and you can get them before they get you. So there's warfare, there's that. There is a sense also that there are penalties for those who do it accidentally. Right, and we've talked about this and the whole idea that there are cities of refuge where the person who commits manslaughter can flee and go and be protected, right? But it's not without consequences, right? So causing someone to die under certain circumstances, there's going to be a penalty. And if it's deliberate, right, penalty in the Torah is death. And unlike other, almost uniquely in ancient Israel, you can't pay the family, right? There can be no monetary compensation. The murderer is simply to be put to death. Now, the rabbinic tradition deals with that, moves away from the death penalty, still allows it to exist, but really moves away using very extreme rules of evidence to mean essentially not beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond any possible doubt. And in fact, we get statements like a court that convicts a person once in 7 years has blood on their hands, and Rabbi Akiva goes further and says once in 50 years. So the rabbis move away from that biblical notion of capital punishment, at least have a strong reluctance to sort of apply it, except in extreme cases. But there's, from the point of view of the Torah, it is absolute. Why? In part because human beings are said to be in the image of God. And that gives human life profound sanctity. And one is not permitted to take the life of another person or even their own life. And I want to emphasize that the Torah is clearly, and Jewish tradition is clearly against suicide. Now, you could say, what about, there are lots of cases that are kind of gray. A person who's on a respirator and not going to get better, and can you take the respirator off? And is that really, part of this prohibition? What if you give medication that really is meant to ease pain, but you also know will hasten a person's death? A lot of these medical issues, which have really come to the forefront, in the last, 50 years, right, really wrestle with this question of when it is and is not murder. And of course, you even have the abortion issue. Right? Is that murder? And there's certainly those who claim that it is. Okay, then we get adultery. There's a famous joke about Moses coming down from the mountain, and he says, "I have good news and bad news." The good news is I kept it to 10. The bad news is adultery is still there. Right? So you can take that for what it's worth. I want to be clear about what adultery is. Adultery is a man who sleeps with a married woman. And it is limited to that. An unmarried man who sleeps with an unmarried woman is not adultery. It's called znut, which is sort of licentiousness, right? The Torah does not approve, particularly if it's if it's kind of random sex, rather than monogamous sex, though unmarried. If it's monogamous sex, though unmarried, we do have the idea of a handmaid in the Torah, right? Abraham's wife, not wife, but Hagar, who he seems to marry later in life, at least that's the rabbinic tradition, is not a full wife, but they have an exclusive sexual relationship. Right? So here we're talking about a married woman who sleeps with an unmarried man, whether he is married or not. However, adultery is not a married man sleeping with an unmarried woman, because the Torah believes it represents a polygamous society. So if a married man could sleep with an unmarried woman, then he can't have more than one wife. And yet the Torah does countenance polygamy. Now, polygamy disappears among Ashkenazic Jews about 1,000 years ago. Famously, it was part of a series of edicts which were promulgated by a rabbi, a famous medieval rabbi, Rabbi Gershon, and accepted by the Ashkenazic world. It was not accepted by the Sephardic world, and there are stories of Yemenite Jews who came to Israel, in the 20th century and came with more than one wife, right? So the point I want to make, however, is that it's not, what we have here is not a prohibition. Adultery is only this kind of sin if the woman is married. Doesn't matter whether the man is married or not. Okay. Thou shalt not steal. Right? Theft. Now, there are those who want to say, and there's a strong rabbinic discussion about this over many, many centuries, as to whether this is merely, whether it is really talking about kidnapping, or is it stealing in general? The argument for kidnapping is that the laws which preceded are, from the Torah's point of view, capital crimes. So take murder, right? So one might think that this too should rise to that level. Moreover, we also have a law in Leviticus which tells us that we're not permitted to steal. So what do we need it for? Right? We must need it to tell us that when it comes to adultery, when it comes to kidnapping, that is much more serious and is a capital offense, right? On the other hand, if the Torah wanted to say that, it could have said that. It could have said, don't kidnap. So there's a whole other stream of the Jewish tradition, and more widely accepted, I think, that this is any kind of theft rather than just the theft of a human being. Okay, and now we come to the commandment of not bearing false witness. And I want to jump ahead, actually jump back for a second to 6th chapter, jump ahead, I'm sorry, to chapter 19, verse 16. It's page 1100. So if you want to turn there quickly. And yes, if a man appears against another to testify maliciously, giving false testimony, the two parties to the dispute will appear before the Lord, before the priest and magistrates. The magistrates make a thorough investigation. If the man who testified is a false witness, if he has testified falsely against his fellow, you will do to him as he schemed to do to his fellow. So later on in the Torah, we do get the consequences here. If your scheme was to get him killed, then you yourself should be put to death, right? The Talmud talks about how we judge this, how the judges do investigate to see if these witnesses are false. I wanted to share with you now something from another part of the Bible entirely, which does deal with false witnesses and also deals with the last of the 10 commandments, and that is the commandment to covet or not to covet. So I'm going to share my screen again, but I'm going to go to, see, how can I do this? This is in the way. See if I can move this down. Oh, all right. Let me do it this way. Let me stop sharing. Let me go here. Let me get rid of this. Okay, go back here. Where is? Yeah, and now I need. Okay, so I've got it now, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and so this is from the book of Kings, chapter 21. And it takes place during the reign of King Ahab of Samaria, who was one of the worst kings and who was married to Izebel. Ahab is called Ahab in modern English translation. Izebel, his wife, is known as Jezebel. So Ahab says to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard so that I may have it as a vegetable garden, since it is right next to my palace. I will give you a better vineyard in exchange, or if you prefer, I'll pay you." But Naboth says, "The Lord forbid that I should give up what I have inherited from my ancestors," right? He said, "I can't do that. It's a family holding. I'm going to pass it to my children. I inherited it." So Ahab goes back home dispirited and sullen. And because of what he said, he lays down in his bed, he turns away his face, he wouldn't eat. He's behaving like a big baby. His wife Jezebel comes to him and says, "Why are you so sad that you won't eat?" And he tells her, "I spoke to Navot and I made this proposal," and he said no. His wife Jezebel says to him, "Now show yourself over Israel. Don't be such a wimp. Rise up, eat something, be cheerful. I'll go get it." So she writes letters in Ahab's name, seals them with his seal, sends the letters to the elders and notables who lived in the town of Navot. And she wrote, "Proclaim a fast and seat Navot at the front of the assembly, and seat 2 scoundrels next to him, and let them testify against him, Navot. You have cursed the king, God and the king. Then take him out and stone him." His townsmen, the elders, and the nobles did as Jezebel had instructed them. They proclaim a fast. They put Navot there. The scoundrels come. They testify against him publicly, saying he's reviled God and the king. They stone him.
God.
Jezebel hears about it. She hears he's been stoned. As soon as she hears, she goes to Ahab. She says, "Go take possession of the vineyard, which Navot, the Jezreelite, refused to sell you for money. He's no longer alive." And Ahab goes and takes it. Right? So that's the story.
Wow.
Yeah, wow is right. So there we have a great case of false witnesses, and it also brings us to a great case of covenant. So unfortunately, I said we were going to finish the 10 Commandments. And we're not, because I haven't gotten to coveting. And coveting, there's really quite a bit to say about it, believe it or not. So I'm going to come back for one final time at the beginning of next week's session. For the moment, I want to give you an opportunity to ask any questions you have about murder, adultery, theft, or false witness. Anything at all that anyone wants to share or to say, to ask. Go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, would a married woman and an unmarried man count as adultery? It probably
Yes,
would.
yes. Anybody who sleeps with a married woman, not her husband, is her husband obviously can, but anyone else who sleeps with her. In fact, when a couple gets divorced, there is, he gives her a get. And at the moment that she receives a get, one of the parts of that ceremony is, it says, "I have given you your get. You are permitted to any other man." Right? In other words, it's very sexist. There's no way around the language of the get being sexist. But the idea there is now it's not adultery. As long as she's married, it is adultery. Okay. Any other questions or requests for clarification? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the question arises, what is considered a marriage?
Okay, so the question of what's considered a marriage is a great question, right? Because adultery only applies if she was actually married. If you could show that she wasn't married, it's not adultery. So according to the Torah doesn't tell us. The Torah only gives us one law. It says, if a couple is married and they're divorced, and she remarries and is divorced, or her husband dies, she's not allowed to marry her first husband. Right. This is probably a way of preventing, wife swapping. Right. He divorces her. She goes to another man. He divorces her quickly. All of this takes place, immediately, and everybody's happy and so on. But at any rate, that law, which is the only mention of marriage and divorce in the Torah, doesn't tell us anything about what is marriage. How do you do it? What is divorce? And so we have a whole oral tradition, right, which is codified in the Talmud, but really must go back, if not to the original revelation on Mount Sinai, it's got to go back very, very early, because you can't apply these laws, and that's why it's a great question unless you know. So, according to the rabbis, there are 3 ways for a couple to get married. Kesef, shtar, and bia. Kesef is gift in the presence of witnesses, a gift of material value, and today it's always a ring, right? A gift of material value in the presence of a witness, where he says, by this ring, you are harei at mikudeshet li b'tabadzo, or you could say in modern English, by this ring, you are wed to me, right? That is enough. Or with a document, a shtar, right, where they write, just as a divorce can be a document, a marriage can actually be a document. And the third way is intercourse. But it has to be of a particular kind, because there have to be witnesses, at least witnesses that see him go in, the couple go into this room alone together, which is, by the way, there is something in a Jewish wedding today, which that is particularly in a traditional Jewish wedding, which is called yichud. Yichud is after the ceremony, the bride and groom need to go to a room alone together. And there are witnesses outside the door to actually make sure the door stays closed, because everybody wants to come and congratulate them, and they need a few moments alone together. The origin of that is this idea that one could, through sex, become a married couple, and there are witnesses involved. Clearly, that was not what was practiced, but rabbinic tradition does need a way to make it clear, for exactly the reasons we're talking about, whether a couple is actually married or not. It's a great question. Okay, anything else? In which case, I want to also thank those of you who contributed to sponsoring this. I really appreciate it. We're going to meet again next week at the same time, and we should be meeting regularly now, except with holidays. Vacation time is over for me, and I was actually eager. I missed doing this class. Glad to be back. I want to wish you all a great week, and I will see you soon. And of course, we'll be sending out the recording if you want to look at it again, or missed anything. So have a great day. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.